A lot of people exercise because they believe it will help them to lose fat.
One of the biggest debates on the planet.
What advice have you got for me?
So this is not a well-known fact, but
Lieberman.
He studies and teaches
How humans are supposed to live.
Author and professor at Harvard University.
Exercise.
Disease, sleep, nutrition.
He has the answers on all of those things that most of us care about.
we evolved to be very physically active, working in the fields, hunting, gathering. But now we live in a world where only 50% of Americans ever exercise, and the rest of the world is headed our way. Cancers, depression, anxiety can attribute that to less physical activity. In fact, women who get 150 minutes of physical activity a week have about 30 to 50% lower breast cancer risks. I mean, it's crazy, right? The problem is that we spend 3% of our medical budget on prevention. And yet 75% of the time, the disease is a preventable disease. It's a completely backward, stupid system.
When you started writing this book about exercise, was there any instant changes that you implemented into your own life?
Strength training. The more I study the importance of doing weights, especially as you age, the more I start kicking myself for being lazy about that. When people retire, they become less active. They tend to lose muscle, and then that starts off a vicious cycle.
So would you say we shouldn't retire?
Well, it's a very modern Western concept, and yes, we do pay a price for it.
So how does one go from having a negative opinion towards exercise to becoming an exerciser?
As an evolutionary biologist, there are multiple ways of doing that. So,
Daniel, what are some of the biggest myths within exercise?
gosh, there are so many. One of the most common, of course, is
Daniel Lieberman. He's been to every corner of the world, visiting native tribes to understand how humans are supposed to live. And now he has the answers on all of those things that most of us care about, on sleep, nutrition, exercise, disease. On disease, he says that 74% of them can be prevented. And he knows how to prevent them. Aging, running. Are we born to run? He tells me the story of a CEO that forces his employees to exercise and the impact that that's had on that company. And he talks about how as humans, we've evolved to either use it or lose it. So maybe retirement is a really bad idea for many of us. One of the most thought-provoking, pivotal conversations I've had on this show. You're really going to take a lot from this one. And I suspect, after listening, you'll probably start running too. For exercise, or from some of the decisions you've spent your life making. Daniel, your work is so incredibly impressive, reaches such an incredible depth, charters new territory, and it's been an unbelievable, clearly very passion-driven career you had. So my first question for you is, why are you doing this?
It's a good question. I started off being obsessed by human evolution. Ever since I was a kid, I was really interested in human evolution, and I spent much of my early career working on skulls and heads and why they are the way they are. And then I kind of got involved in public health and issues of health and disease kind of through the back door. I sort of slowly shifted my research trajectory towards studying the evolution of running and then the evolution of physical activity and its relationship to health and disease. And I've become part of a movement that's often known as evolutionary medicine, which is how to apply evolutionary theory and data to issues of health and disease.
Evolutionary medicine. I've never heard that term before, but I love it. Where has your work on evolutionary medicine, let's call it, where has that taken you? Where has it taken you to learn, to research, to study?
So much of what we think about in terms of health and disease comes from a tiny fragment of the world's population. Almost entirely, like 90% of all the medical information comes from people from the United States, Canada, Europe, and Australia. So in order to study how bodies really work and how our bodies evolved to be, you have to leave places like Boston, where I live, and go to places like Africa or Mexico or wherever to look at other populations and look at how those populations are transitioning to lifestyles like mine. And so we've been working in Kenya for the last 15 years or so. I've traveled to some other parts of the world as well, India, to kind of collect some data, but mostly in Africa.
After doing all of this work and after taking in all of this information, how has it shifted your perspective on running, exercise more broadly? Have there been any sort of significant cognitive perception changes?
Yeah. I actually had it doesn't happen very often, but I had kind of an epiphany moment When I was working in Mexico, we were collecting data on the Tarahumara, very also famous for their long-distance running. And there was this elderly guy, he's about 70-something years old, and he's famous for his distance running. And I was asking him how he trained, and I had asked this question of a whole bunch of other people. And the translator I was working with was always struggling to ask that question, because it turns out there's no word for training in that language. The concept of training doesn't exist. So she was trying to explain to this guy what my question was. And I could, even without a translator, I could figure out just from his tone of voice. He was like, why would anybody run if you didn't have to? And I suddenly realized, yeah, of course, exercise is a very weird thing, right? Well, if you're a farmer and you're working super hard every day in the fields without machines and whatever, or if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're walking, 5 to 10 miles a day and digging and throwing, doing all kinds of hard work and you're barely getting enough food, why on earth would you go for a needless 5-mile run in the morning? I mean, it's crazy, right?
The most viewed videos of yours and the most viewed moments in those videos address one question. Do you have any idea what it might be?
No, actually.
The biggest myths in exercise.
Right.
And I think you actually pointed out one there with the insight you got in Mexico. The way we exercise, going to gyms, practicing, is the natural or human, but evidently it's a consequence of the privilege of our lives and the comfort we have of not having to seek out our dinner every day. What are some of the other biggest myths within exercise that you've come across in writing this book?
Gosh, there are so many. I had to actually limit it to 10. So I think if you want to understand physical activity and exercise, you also have to understand inactivity. And I think one of the biggest myths out there is that you need 8 hours of sleep a night. And that sitting is the new smoking, that basically, and if you think about those two different myths, why is it that we're constantly told to sleep more and to sit less? Actually, it seems a little contradictory to me, right? And it turns out that, that let's take sitting first. So, there are all these, these slogans like sitting is the new smoking and it's really bad for you. And, every time you sit in your chair, you lose 2 hours of your life and whatever. It turns out that all animals sit, right? My dog sits, cows sit, chickens sit, every animal sits. And hunter-gatherers also sit. In fact, if you, some of my students actually put sensors on hunter-gatherers, and we're doing some research in farmers as well, but they sit just as much as Westerners. So sitting there's nothing special about being about today's life. It's sitting. It's that we sit all day long and don't do anything when we're not sitting, right? So if you, and furthermore, the big difference is not so much how much we sit, but how we sit. So it turns out that people who, if you get up every once in a while, right, interrupted sitting is actually much more healthy than non-interrupted sitting for the same amount of time. So in other words, two people might, in the West, people sit for an average about 40 minutes at about, whereas hunter-gatherers, for example, or farmers in Africa where we work, get up every about 10, 15 minutes. And when you do that, you actually, it's like turning on the engine of your car, driving around the block. You're turning on all kinds of cellular mechanisms, you lower blood sugar levels, all kinds of genes get activated. And it turns out that is by far the most important way to sit. So just get up every once in a while. Just pee frequently, make a cup of tea, pet your dog, whatever.
Thinking when I'm on planes and I've got a long flight.
Yeah, I always sit in the aisle, right? So I can get up a lot, always. And
what about sleep then?
So sleep is another interesting one. So this idea that, that you need 8 hours of sleep has been around for a long time. It's been around basically since the Industrial Revolution. But if you actually, so colleagues in my field, so in evolutionary medicine, have put sensors on people who don't have all the things that we're told have destroyed sleep. So think about it. We're told that TV and lights and our phones and all these things are preventing us from sleeping. Edison destroyed sleep, right? So when you put sensors on people who don't have any electricity, and they don't have TVs, and they don't have phones, and they don't have any of these gadgetry, right? Electricity. It turns out they sleep like 6 to 7 hours a night, and they don't nap. So this idea that natural human beings sleep 8 hours a night is just nonsense. It's just not true. And furthermore, when you start looking at the data, 7 hours. If you graph sort of how many hours a night you sleep on the x-axis and sort of some outcome like cardiovascular disease or just how likely you are to die, it's kind of a U-shaped curve. So people who don't get much sleep are in trouble. But the bottom of that curve is pretty much always about 7 hours. So people actually do better if they sleep 7 hours rather than 8 hours. And yet we're told that if you don't sleep 8 hours, there's something wrong, right?
Oh, so you can oversleep.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's also some complexity to this too, because of course people who are ill might be sleeping more, and so there's some biases that creep into how you analyze the data. But basically, it turns out that 7 is, for most people, optimal. But there's a lot of variation, right? Teenagers sleep more, older people sleep less. It's complicated.
One of the things that popular in culture as well is this idea of doing 10,000 steps a day.
Yeah, now that's fun. That started because of a Japanese pedometer. But right before the Olympics were in Tokyo in the 60s, they had invented the pedometer, and they were sitting in a boardroom, and they were discussing what to call the pedometer. And they picked, out of the blue, they picked 10,000 steps because that's apparently an auspicious number. And it sounded about right. There was no science behind it. Interestingly, it turns out it's pretty good. If you look at steps per day and health outcomes, your average hunter-gatherer walks between 10 to 18,000 steps, depends on male, female, etc. And if you look at steps per day and outcomes, at around 7 to 8,000 steps, the curve kind of bottoms out. Right? There doesn't seem to be a huge advantage to taking more than that per day in terms of large epidemiological studies. So it turns out to be not that bad a goal, but it's not a perfect number like a lot of things, right? It's just it's a reasonable goal to shoot for.
When you started writing this book about exercise and running and all these subject matters, was there any instant changes or any real lasting changes that you implemented into your own life from everything you'd learnt? I think about that all the time with this podcast. I'll have a guest on, I have these mini eureka moments, and then something will stick. So I'm wondering, having studied all of these people all around the world and looked at their bodies and exercise and physical exertion, what have you taken into your own life that has stuck?
I would say that I've become more serious about doing some strength training. I've always loved walking and running and endurance kinds of activities, and I've always sort of hated doing weights. I just don't like it, and I'm a wimp. I'm not a very strong person, and people tend to do what they like, right? You get reinforcement from it, and the more I study the importance of resistance training, and the more I study the importance of doing weights, especially as you age, the more I started kicking myself for being lazy about that. So now I try to do good 2 strength workouts out of every week at least, and take it more seriously, because especially as you age, loss of muscle mass can be really debilitating. There's the technical term for that is sarcopenia. Sarco is the Greek word for muscle, and penia is loss, so muscle loss. So as people get older, they tend to lose muscle, and when you do that, you become frail and you lose functional capacity, and then that starts off a vicious cycle, right? Once that happens, then you'll be less likely to be physically active, and then of course when you're less physically active, your muscles begin to waste away more, and it's very debilitating. And so I think as we get older, and I'm getting older, it's more and more important, to kind of incorporate that. So I think that's the one thing that I've taken to heart.
Yeah, from what you said there, it sounds like not doing resistance training, not lifting weights as you age, almost accelerates aging in any sort of superficial sense, but also in a physiological sense, you're increasing the speed of aging.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'd think about it that way, but I think I'd kind of reverse it slightly, which is that aging is just the clock ticking on, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing we can do about age, but senescence is the way our bodies degrade as we get older. And what physical activity does, actually maybe the most important thing about physical activity, is that it slows senescence, especially for certain organs and systems. And there are different kinds of physical activities. So there's endurance physical activities, like running, walking, etc., swimming, and then strength or resistance physical activities. And they have different kinds of ways in which they slow various properties of senescence, which we, colloquially call aging. And all of them are important. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about humans, in fact, I think it may be the most important thing about this book, and you asked about myths earlier, the most important myth, I think, by far, is this idea that as you get older, it's normal to be less active. And that is just not true. We evolved to be grandparents. We evolved to live. One of the things that's most interesting about humans, maybe, is that we evolved to live about 20 years or so after we stop reproducing. No other animal does that except except orcas, maybe killer whales. But with the exception of killer whales, humans have this really weird life history. We evolved to be grandparents. But grandparents in the old days weren't, retiring to Florida, or I don't know what they do in England or whatever, go to Mallorca or whatever, and kick up their heels and play golf or whatever with carts. Grandparents in the olden days, right, or in many cultures still today, are working, right? They're working in the fields, they're hunting, they're gathering, they're getting food for their children and their grandchildren, they're helping with childcare. And that physical activity is, that's what their job is, to be physically active. But in turn, that physical activity turns on an amazing suite of physiological processes that counter aging. It turns on repair and maintenance processes that not only keep our muscles strong, but also keep our DNA from accruing mutations, keep our mitochondria numbers high, keep the cells in our brain from accumulating gunk, so that prevents Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. I mean, for every system of the body, physical activity has benefits that slow the aging process. And so when you stop doing it, you accelerate, and that's the way in which you perceive it as accelerating aging. But really, it's the absence of physical activity which lets aging run amok.
In your first book in 2013, The Story of the Human Body, in chapter 12, you said, you used this phrase, use it or lose it, basically. We evolved to use or lose our bodies. And I was sat with someone recently, and I was trying to figure out why it appears that when people retire, or the other instance I've seen is when their elderly partner passes away, it appears as if they don't live much longer.
Yeah.
It's kind of folklore or something, that once you retire, your days are kind of numbered.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out the evolutionary reason for that, but it sounds like it's kind of what you've explained there.
Well, I mean, I think part of that is depression, right? When you lose a partner, I mean, grief and depression, your cortisol levels go up, your immune system goes down. I mean, it's really tough on your body. I mean, psychosocial stress plays a serious physiological toll. But also, as you just pointed out, when people retire, they become less active, and that loss of activity has enormous effects on every aspect of our body. I mean, and our minds. I mean, physical activity is important not just for physical health, but also vital for mental health. And I think a lot of the problems that a lot of mental health issues we have today, depression, anxiety, some of them, to some extent, we can attribute that to less physical activity. And as people age, becoming less physically active, again, makes them much more vulnerable to a wide suite of diseases.
So would you say we shouldn't retire?
Or if you do retire, I mean, retiring is, again, another modern weird thing, right? Nobody retired in the past. I mean, if you're a farmer, it's like a subsistence farmer, and name it, any place, right? It's not like suddenly you hit 65 and all of a sudden you no longer have to work in the fields. You work in the fields until you're dead, right? And hunter-gatherers don't retire. They continue to be physically active until they die, right? Or until they get too sick. So it's a very modern Western concept, and yes, we do pay a price for it. But you, of course, can replace, work that you do with challenging, rewarding, fun things to do. The important thing is just not to stop being physically active. One of my favorite studies ever published, without a doubt, is a study done by a guy named Ralph Paffenbarger. He realized that places like Harvard are fantastic for studying aging, because Harvard, like other private universities, never lets go of their alumni. So until the day you die, they're asking you for money on a regular basis. and so he got the Alumni Association, the Harvard Development Office, to let him follow a series of Harvard alumni from several years, and can keep asking them questions about their physical activity levels and also their diet and whether they smoked and stuff like that. And then he tracked them for 25, 30 years. And what he found was that the alumni, after you corrected for every factor you could think of, that as the alumni got older, the effect of physical activity on their health outcomes was bigger and bigger. So alumni who were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, for example, who were exercising 4 or 5 times a week, they had about 20% lower death rates. By the time they got to their 60s and 70s, the alumni who were exercising more had 50% lower death rates. So as you get older, and this has been replicated again many times, but what he showed was that as you get older, exercise becomes more, not less important for maintaining your health.
Been thinking a lot about this because I was saying to Jack, my dad is 60-ish, but he's very, very out of shape. Very, very out of shape. And I was in Indonesia, and I was with my girlfriend, and we were going whitewater rafting. So we had to go down this really big hill with all these stairs. It was like 300 meters of stairs. And I remember just thinking, my dad wouldn't be able to do this at his age at 60, and I want to be able to go down those stairs when I'm his age, because at the bottom of there was a fun activity with someone I loved. And to think that I'll get to a point in my life where, not so far away in the grand scheme of things, where I won't be able to go up or down some stairs because I'm 60, because of my sort of genetic predisposition, as I saw it, was quite sad. But having heard you say that, it really feels much more like a choice than it is genetics.
Yeah, look, we have this expression in my field, which is that genes load the gun and environment pulls the trigger, right? Some of us have genetic predispositions towards being, more likely to get diabetes or heart disease or this or that or the other. But our great-great-great-grandparents in different environments weren't getting these diseases, or they were getting them at much, much, much lower frequencies. It's not because they were dying earlier. It's because these diseases were less common. So I think we too often blame our genes for many of these diseases, or many of these health problems. And I'm not in any way denying the role of genetics, but that environment is way more important. And we have control over our environment to some extent. And so if you want to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, reduce your risk of diabetes, reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, dementia, exercise isn't a magic bullet. It's not going to prevent you from getting those diseases completely, but it lowers your risk quite substantially. And we know why, too. I mean, we have an immense amount of data on why that's the case. For every single one of these diseases, we understand the mechanisms by which physical activity has, important mechanistic effects on these diseases. So there's epidemiological data, there's mechanistic data, there's personal data. The problem is that it's hard to do, right? It takes willpower to overcome the inertia of doing what's completely normal, which is wanting to take it easy, right? I just flew yesterday from Denver to Boston, and in the airport, there are these escalators right next to the stairway, right? And the escalator and the stair, it wasn't a huge stairway. Everybody's lining up to take the escalator, and the stairs are totally free. So being me, I'm not allowed to take the escalator unless, I have to, right? So I ran up the stairs, but those people taking the escalator, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not lazy. It's just an instinct, right? It's an instinct to take it easy when you can, right? Because we now live in a world where everybody can do that, right? Because we have escalators and lifts and cars and shopping carts and all these wonderful devices to make our lives easier. And now you have to overcome this fundamental basic instinct to take it easy in order to be physically active. And that's basically what exercise is. And so, and furthermore, if you're unfit and you're not really, exercising isn't any fun, right? It's unpleasant. You sweat and you get hot and you get cranky and it's not that rewarding until you get fit. And so people hate it, right? And then we blame them for being lazy, but they're actually just being normal. And I think we need to have more compassion towards people who struggle to exercise.
Quick one before we get back to this episode. Just give me 30 seconds of your time. Two things I wanted to say. The first thing is a huge thank you for listening and tuning into the show week after week. It means the world to all of us, and this really is a dream that we absolutely never had and couldn't have imagined getting to this place. But secondly, it's a dream where we feel like we're only just getting started. And if you enjoy what we do here, please join the 24% of people who watch this channel regularly and have hit that subscribe button. It means more than I can say. And if you hit that subscribe button, here's a promise I'm going to make to you. I'm going to do everything in my power to make this show as good as I can now and into the future. We're going to deliver the guests that you want me to speak to, and we're going to continue to keep doing all of the things you love about this show. Thank you. Thank you so much. Back to the episode. This basic instinct to take it easy. Are we evolved to be lazy, take escalator riders?
Well, I wouldn't use the word lazy, but we are evolved to take it easy, to rest whenever possible, right?
So we've now got ourselves into a bit of a comfort crisis here because everything in our lives is optimizing us for convenience and ease.
Right. And well, it's also, it sells, right? I mean, comfort, I mean, who prefers to sit in economy as opposed to business class, right? Nobody, right? Comfort is nice, right? Who prefers shoes that are uncomfortable, right? We comfort's, we love comfort, right? But since when is comfort necessarily better for you, right? I mean, are comfortable shoes actually better for you than going barefoot? Are the comfortable chairs better for you than, or taking the lift better for you than taking the stairs?
It is in the short term, or at least it appears to be today.
Right, yes, because we often value the short-term benefit over the long-term cost, right? That's hyperbolic discounting is the technical term for that. But so we live in a world where we pay extra for comfort, and we'll prefer it. But now we also live in a world where we have to now go out of our way to be physically active because it's no longer necessary. And so again, I go back to my original statement, which is that people evolved to be physically active for two reasons and two reasons only: when it's necessary or rewarding. When we don't make it necessary, we need to figure out ways to make it rewarding. And that's hard. It's very hard.
Making it rewarding. So one way that you might make something rewarding is by looking at the stick, and then the other side is maybe the carrot. But just looking at the stick, then you were going through a series of diseases a second ago: Alzheimer's, high blood pressure, all of these kinds of things, cardiovascular diseases. I almost think we've come to assume that these are inevitabilities of life.
Yeah,
we'll get cancer.
Yeah,
one of us will get.
Yeah,
someone in here is going to get Alzheimer's, and that's the way we live. So we're preparing to medicate when that day comes.
That's right.
I get, God forbid, diagnosed with something.
That's absolutely right. In fact, that's what medical students today are taught, right? If you go to medical school today, you're taught that as people get older, their blood pressure goes up. I can tell you that's just not true. It's in the Western world where people are physically inactive and eat crap diets that their blood pressure tends to go up. But there are plenty of people, I'm actually one of them, right, who don't have high blood pressure as they age. And guess what's the best way to prevent getting high blood pressure as you age? It's, it sounds like a broken record, but we have this idea that as you get older, yes, and we're lucky, right? Because we don't die from smallpox when we're 30. We're lucky to get cancer when we're 60, right? What we've done is we've confused diseases that are more common with aging with age being a cause of those diseases in the first place. And they're not inevitable diseases. And many of them are preventable. And the problem is that in our society, we don't value prevention very much. We may talk about it, but we don't really put our money where our mouth is, right? In the US, which is arguably one of the worst healthcare systems, it is the worst healthcare system among the industrialized Western world, we spend approximately 3% of our budget, our medical budget, on prevention. And yet when people walk into a doctor's office, 75% of the time the disease is, according to the Center for Disease Control, a preventable disease. So we essentially spend nothing to prevent diseases that overwhelm our system and cause enormous amounts of misery. It's a completely backward, stupid system. And so, and the good news is it's not that hard to prevent a lot of these things. It takes willpower and takes education, and it takes access to good quality food and whatever. So in the one sense, it's very depressing. On the other hand, the optimist in me says, we really can do something. And people, even if they're not wealthy or whatever, there are simple things that everybody can do to improve their health outcomes.
These diseases we encounter today as we age, and just generally in our society, when you look at hunter-gatherer communities, or you look at certain tribes around the world, maybe in Africa, do you see the same types of diseases in the same level of occurrence? Or is there some diseases which just don't, I'm wondering if because cancer seems to be so popular as a disease, and Alzheimer's and these kinds of things. So I wonder, has that always been the case throughout human history? And is that the case in other parts of the world?
That is such a good question. So first of all, some of these diseases are really hard to measure in non-Western populations because we don't have the diagnostic tools. So nobody really knows how common cancer is in a lot of parts of the world, right? There's just the data don't exist. That said, when you make estimates and you do look at the studies that are out there, and even if you look in historical records in places like Europe where people have been keeping track of this, there is no question that cancer rates have been rising and that cancer rates are much, much more common in the Western world. There's a strong association between cancer and wealth. And that's because cancer is basically a disease of energy, right? When your cells, because cancer is basically natural selection gone awry in the body. It's when cells start competing with each other in ways that cause basically and start going multiplying and dividing out of control, right? It's a kind of natural selection. And what is it that those cells are doing? They're competing for energy. And when you have more energy, like when you're eating more and being less physically active, you basically feed those cells. So cancer, high levels of insulin. Insulin is highly related to cancer. High insulin levels are carcinogenic. High levels of energy, you cause women, for example, to increase the amount of estrogen and progesterone that they produce. Men produce more testosterone. These are hormones that, of course, are good for reproduction. But again, we evolved to have as many babies as possible, right? But that doesn't mean that translates into health, right? So more estrogen, more progesterone increases risks of, say, breast cancer, or testosterone increases the risk of prostate cancer. So if you look at most diseases, right, people are more physically active. They have lower levels of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. They have lower levels of insulin. They have lower levels of blood sugar. All of these depress cancer rates. And on average, people who are physically active have much lower rates of almost every single kind of cancer that you can think of. Women who walk 150, get 150 minutes of physical activity a week have, on average, about 30 to 50% lower lifetime breast cancer risks than people who are sedentary. And yet, for some reason, this is not a well-known fact. And we understand we have epidemiological data, we have mechanistic data, we understand how and why it works, and yet, how often do you hear about cancer prevention? We talk about treating cancer, which is all important. If I get cancer, I would like it treated too. Thank you very much. But why don't we spend more energy and activity and have more education about how to prevent cancers in the first place?
Physical I've never heard that before, so that's really helped me to add more value to exercise in my mind. You were talking there about insulin levels and how there's a link between your insulin levels and your chances of getting cancer. Sugar, glucose, inflammation.
Bad. Yeah, I mean, look, if you want to take like the three things you should, if you really care about your health, don't smoke, right? That's kind of obvious. I think everybody knows that. Get some exercise. I don't think you need me to tell you that, right? And cut down on sugar, on foods that are high in sugar and low in fiber, right? That, what we call high glycemic foods. Those are the foods that elevate your blood glucose levels, your insulin levels shoot up. And insulin, the basic function of insulin is what we call an anabolic hormone. Its job is to store energy. Right? Glucose, but also fat.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So insulin, what insulin does is to get energy into cells.
So it's like a taxi. It's like an Uber.
It's like a taxi, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a taxi. It's telling other cells to do that. So insulin, for example, binds to other cells that are the actual taxis. So it's like calling the Uber, I would say, maybe, right? And insulin is it's the So when you eat food, insulin levels go up because its job is to store that energy. And when you exercise, insulin levels go down because you want to then use that energy, right? So when cells get more energy, they're more prone to going out of control, basically. And inflammation is caused by you store so much fat in your cells that those fat cells start to swell. And when those start to swell, like anything, right, they start to rupture, they get damaged. And that damage attracts the immune system, and the immune system gets turned on, and that causes inflammation. So too much adiposity, too much fat, over-swollen fat cells is a primary cause of systemic inflammation. And inflammation is like this slow burn in our bodies that causes widespread damage to pretty much everything you can think of. And it turns out that, so the two ways to deal with inflammation are, one, to prevent it, right? So don't eat foods that are pro-inflammatory.
Like?
Anything with a lot of sugar, basically, right? The sugar is highly inflammatory, or trans fats are highly inflammatory. But also, turns out, many people don't know this, but you also want to turn down your immune system, right? You want to turn the dial down. And I don't know, I'll just give you one guess what it is that does that. Exercise. And the way it does that is that when you're physically active, you're using your muscle cells. It turns out muscles are also an endocrine organ. Your muscles are producing a molecule called interleukin-6, IL-6, that in low levels is pro-inflammatory, but at high levels, it's actually anti-inflammatory. It turns down inflammation. And your muscles, because a third of your body is muscle, right? When you go for a run or swim or bike ride or whatever, you're producing a ton of this stuff, and it turns down levels of inflammation. So people are physically active, even if they're overweight, are actually controlling and regulating their inflammation. And we never evolved to regulate inflammation because we never evolved to be physically inactive. Until recently, nobody was physically inactive unless they were dying, right? So we never evolved an alternative mechanism to regulate our inflammation other than physical activity.
And we didn't live in a world with this much sugar.
We never lived in a world. I mean, it's astonishing. You pay more money for foods today that have less sugar added. Right? I mean, that's just ridiculous, right? Because it's so cheap. And sugar is, everybody loves sugar. I mean, I've gone hunting with hunter-gatherers, foraging with hunter-gatherers. And I can tell you that they're honey addicts, right? I mean, I've gone out with these guys and they go from, if they fail in their hunt, like by 10 or 11, if you haven't killed an animal, that's it for the day, right? And then it turns from being a hunting expedition to a honey collecting expedition. And they'll go from hive to hive to hive, get smoke, burn out the bees, and just gorge themselves on more honey than I could possibly imagine to eat. Except these are lean, physically active hunter-gatherers, and they handle it just fine. But it's the Paleolithic equivalent of eating Mars bars all day long.
But they've been out doing physical activity for how long?
Yeah, I mean the average day is about 15 kilometers of walking with some running. Yeah, so they're they can cope with it.
How many hours is that?
Oh, that's 2 to 3 hours probably.
Okay, so from that I have garnered that I need to do 15 kilometers a day for 2 or 3 hours every day.
Well, remember, it's not a prescription, right? So that's kind of like the paleo fantasy, sort of naturalistic fantasy that if you live like a hunter-gatherer, somehow your world will be perfect, right? Mm. That's basically what the paleo diet is sort of all about, right? And that's not true either. Yes, you need to be physically active, but it turns out that a certain amount, if you're any physical activity is better than none, right? And if you look at the kind of any curve of any output, any health outcome, like how many years you live or whether you're less likely to get cancer or heart disease or whatever, any little physical activity, the curve starts to fall quickly, right? Your likelihood of cardiovascular disease starts just, a few minutes a day of exercise has big benefits. But eventually that curve flattens out, right? And it flattens out well before the hunter-gatherer level. So you don't need to be a hunter-gatherer in terms of physical activity to get the benefits.
I've asked a few people this question. I don't think anyone's really answered it, but I suspect you might be able to. If you were responsible for redesigning the nature of our modern world to make it more matched and less mismatched, what are some of the first things you would do to help society benefit in terms of our happiness and our health? I think about this all the time because we don't seem to be turning around. We seem to be hurtling in a direction, kind of unconsciously, towards artificial intelligence and moving less and being more sedentary and taking pills more to fix everything. Lonelier than ever before. And I go, if we were to redesign it, blank canvas, piece of paper.
That's a tough question because we've essentially given ourselves what we want, right? I can go into a supermarket and I can do something that's unimaginable until recently. I can have basically anything I can eat better than the King of France, a few generations ago. New York, there's like every cuisine possibly available to me. I don't ever have to climb the stairs. I can take elevators. I mean, we've made our world so convenient and comfortable, and yet there are consequences to many of the things that we crave and want. So, in an ideal world, you have to honor and respect people's desires, right? I don't believe in preventing people from taking the elevator, right? Or forcing them to, eat whole grain bread as opposed to white bread, right?
But if you banned white bread and you banned elevators, other than for those people that need it for accessibility reasons, etc.,
they would do better.
Over the long term, they would be healthier and happier.
They would, right. So it's really a balancing act between respecting people's liberties and choices and educating them and helping them. So in my world, I would do more to nudge people, right? I would, instead of banning sugar, I would tax it more. Instead of pushing all kinds of foods on people, I would push. I mean, why don't we advertise healthy foods the way we advertise unhealthy foods, right? I mean, when's the last time you saw an ad for just how amazingly healthy asparagus was, right?
But that doesn't get the part of my brain going, does it?
No, it doesn't. But we could do more to nudge and encourage and help people, right? You don't have to like ban sugar and cookies, right? The way some people, but simply promote and help people help themselves, right? Most people want to eat healthier food. Most people want to exercise, but they live in a world where it's hard to do it, and they live in a world where there are very few incentives. I would make it such that healthy food would be as inexpensive as unhealthy food, and make sure that people had incentives and make it also fun to be physically active. Like, for example, who doesn't like to dance, right? Every culture in the world has dancing, right? Dancing is a form of physical activity. It's social, it's fun, it's engaging. Why don't we have, why doesn't every town in America sponsor dancing, right? It would probably do an enormous amount for people's physical health and their mental health. I mean, we could do that. I mean, that's just one example, right? So I would, and why is it that in medical schools, doctors don't learn about, they don't study nutrition, and they don't study exercise, and they don't learn, because in our medical system is designed to treat people after they get sick rather than prevent people from getting sick. So we need to, reverse how we fund healthcare, right? And so schools of public health are these kind of little marginalized places where where great ideas go to die, right? And medical schools where all the money is, right? And doctors aren't taught to I mean, there are entire fields of medicine that don't have the word preventive associated with it. I mean, have you ever heard of preventive orthodontics or preventive optometry or preventive orthopedics? I mean, it just doesn't exist, right? So we could do a lot more and have enormous benefits.